probably haven't come across Sergey Troshin. Sergey Troshin is a member of the Yabloko party in St. Petersburg. That's a sort of minor opposition party. And he came out as gay shortly before the Russian anti-LGBTQ plus law spread and was promulgated by Putin a couple of months ago. Now, so far, he remains in the council in St. Petersburg, and there have been attempts to investigate him and to see whether or not he has offended that law, broken that law. But so far, he has escaped punishment. He may not do so in the end. Russia has moved into a form of fascism. And although it talks often, although Putin talks often about the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, although the trolls on the internet talk about the neo-Nazis in the Ukraine, it is quite clearly a neo-Nazi organization that comes from the Kremlin, which is the problem. And why has this happened? Because Putin and his cadre need to blame others for their failure. And their failure is enormous. And their failure has been ongoing for 20-odd years. It's customary in Putin's Russia to blame others and to extol the virtues of his own messianic office. So terrorist attacks were dismissed and Putin was honoured. The pandemic was pretty well dismissed. Putin washed his hands of the pandemic, in effect, by promoting little or no efficacious vaccine. And the war in Chechnya, the failure, one failure on top of another. And each time Putin has managed to promote himself. And now this dreadful Ukraine adventure. Deflect and distract from the military failure and blame others. That is the Putin method. And it slid quite significantly into fascism, ducking accountability by blaming foreign agents or the LGBTQ plus community. This is a fascist approach to rule, a genuinely fascist approach to rule, and the only neo-Nazis are in the Kremlin. It's also taking a sort of prison-like mentality and imposing it on the entire population, a state gulag. And listen to the language, the great Russia. That parallels the great Germany of Hitler, the great Rome of Mussolini. And how has Putin done this? By disempowering any political alternatives, by impounding, by imprisoning any opposition or dissenting voices. So when you look at the language which is being used against Ukraine, there's not a consistent enemy, there's not a consistent reason for the Ukraine war. At one point it was the denazification of Ukraine. At another point it's the attack against the Satanists in Ukraine. At another point, it's an attack on the non-traditional lifestyles in the Ukraine. At another point, it's about securing the necessary territories and securing the Russian population in the Ukraine. At another point, it's a NATO aggression. And where did the anti-gay laws come from? Well, there is history there in Russia. There were anti-gay laws established by Nicholas I and then repealed under the initial Bolshevik rule, under the initial rule of the communists in 1917, and then quietly reintroduced by Stalin. But why? Introduced by Stalin as a way of blackmailing his enemies. Blackmail. Now, I don't think blackmail is the aim here. The aim here is to create a prison society, a society that is effectively one large gulag. But at the same time, that society, which can be dismissed as a society of convicts, a society of people who do not matter, that society is a distraction from any form of accountability. Putin is not accountable to the international community nor to his own people. And Putin is more concerned about control and keeping control than he is about ruling, than he is about governing. The obsession with Putin and his group is to cling to power. That's his only motive. His only motive, probably, in going to war in Ukraine in the first place, was to cling to power. And he thought this war would be straightforward and simple. The consequence of this war will be the loss of his own power. The consequence of his law will be the destruction of his own country. Not necessarily with missiles and bombs from Ukraine, but by a total disintegration of everything that Russia stands for. Because the way in which Putin is controlling his people is by destroying every possible semblance of law and order that exists. Law and order has become repression. Any voice which is not Putin's is silenced. So should Putin go, there is nothing left. The opposition have all fallen out of windows or are in prison. That is the problem. Putin's society is a repressive, fascistic society. It is fundamentally wrong. It is morally corrupt. And so many Russians are suffering under the brutality and repression of this hideous man in Kubinsky heels. There's nothing more to say.